Good day, everybody, and welcome to the CNPS, Chappelle Natural Philosophy Society, Saturday talks. These are these alternative talks which we hold every other Saturday on a more detailed analysis of some aspects of fundamental physics. Welcome. It's Midsummer's Day as well, so the weather is beautiful here. My name is Ian Cowan from Ireland, from Dublin, Ireland, and I'll be moderating these alternative sessions for the moment. So as usual, we have people coming in through Facebook and YouTube, and they'll be posting comments to the comment section here, which I can basically see. Now, most of you actually engage in conversation between yourselves or maybe comments, which is fine. I mean, you're invited to do that, and that's great. But if you have any specific question or answer, or maybe contest against something I say, or something maybe Jean de Clement says, just put it in and we can address that. We also have a small number of people in the so-called green room, and I'll be inviting them to come in later. They may actually just wave their hands, and that will indicate that they have something very specific to say. But even if they don't do that, I'll be asking for your advice. Okay, so those are the preliminaries. Now, today, what we have, I think it'll be an interesting change. This gentleman, Dr. Jean de Clement in France, was referred to us. And in fact, I was in some correspondence with him some time ago. And he has quite a number of of videos put up on the public YouTube, and they can be viewed both en français et en anglais, so you can get the English version alongside the French as well. But I was trying to persuade him to talk, maybe, and he was rather reluctant to. I think the final reason was that English wasn't his first language, and he thought it might be too much of a burden on us. Well, I didn't agree with that, but anyway, have to accept his view. So he may be here in the background. I don't know. I have invited him to today's talk. But what we propose to do is we'll bring up some of his videos. And in fact, the initial videos seem to be something like on what Jean calls the failure of Maxwell and Einstein on and related topics through an examination of his videos. Well, that's what we'll be talking today. The views are basically on Aether, and what he claims is the failure of Maxwell and Einstein through an examination. That's what we say. I'm just reading out actually what the title of the talk is. So basically, since we don't have a speaker, what I'll endeavor to do is share my screen and open up one or two of videos and perhaps engage in a little conversation. And now I have had a look at some of these videos myself, and they are pretty rushed. They seem to be, there's some music and it goes through quickly. So it may be required to look at any particular video more than once, or it may even be desirable to reduce the speed of the broadcast. One can do that. One can maybe slow the thing down. But what I propose to do is I'll go into the site now, and I'll maybe just show this first video on not only challenging Einstein's development of the Maxwellian electrodynamics, but challenging some fundamental aspects of Maxwell himself. I think things like displacement current. And after we've looked at the video, depending upon the comments you make, and if anybody in the green room wants to come in, we can decide whether to go ahead and just discuss that for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then maybe look at another video which is expanding on that or supplementing that, or whether you don't want to talk about the first video, maybe play another video and talk about that. So I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so what I have to do now is I have to get up the thing, but I also have to present my screen. So let me see. I think I'll just share my screen, and I'll share the entire screen. I'll then put up the thing. And so here's the failure of Maxwell and Einstein, Aether. So that lasts, it's almost 20 minutes, mind you. So even though it appears we don't have a speaker and we'll be wanting to spend the time, I think the time will just fly by and we'll run out of time within the 2 hours as normal. So I'll start this 20-minute video and we'll talk about it afterwards.
Men over 50 whose prostate is choking their urethra need to see this. Here's a picture of my dad.
Maxwell's theory was just a fanciful interpretation of Faraday's and Ampere's experiments. The theory of special relativity has been questioned as soon as Maxwell's electromagnetic theory was eliminated. The Michelson and Morley interferometer had detected speeds that can reach 9 kilometers per second. Professor Allais has nullified the relativistic interpretation of Michelson and Morley's experiment. Miller's measurements highlighted the need for an ether to explain the correlations between the relative motions of the Moon, Earth, and Sun. Finally, Professor Sellery took away all hope from relativists by demonstrating that the theory of special relativity can in no way explain Sagnac's experiment. As a consequence of Sellery's paradox, there can be no relativistic metric of rotation around an axis. The theory of general relativity therefore cannot explain this experience either. Ether particles have an angular momentum. This angular moment explains the polarization of light. This same ether explains gravitation. An ether therefore fills space from the confines of the universe to the very interior of the atoms. It is made up of particles like all fluids. In this ether, the only possible explanation for the result of Professor Allais' analyses is that the ether has flows compatible both mainly with the rotation of the Earth around the Sun and with its own rotation around its axis. The ether must be dragged along with the Earth around the Sun. This drag negates the relative speed of Earth and ether. In order for there to be an effect of the Sun, the ether has to move towards the Sun, condenses in the Sun. There is no other way to explain the shifts measured at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. when the Michelson and Morley interferometer is in a plane containing the Sun and the Earth. This shift is slightly modified by the eccentricity of the Earth's trajectory. There is also a corrective effect in the Earth-Moon direction resulting from the condensation of ether in the Moon. Another corrective effect results from the rotation of the ether around the Earth. The Michelson and Morley interferometer is always in a horizontal plane, therefore perpendicular to the flow of condensation of ether in the Earth. This flow has no effect on the interferometer. Matter is practically empty. The nuclei occupy only the 10th to the 100,000th part of the atoms. For simplicity, the frictions in the ether are neglected. It is a perfect fluid and therefore without fluid drag. It is the paradox of D'Alembert. But it carries waves. It is also an ideal gas. However, there is a pressure drag in ideal gases. In fact, the speed of these ether currents adds to the speed of agitation of the ether particles on the front surface of the atom nuclei, and subtracts at the back. There is thus an overpressure on one side, and a depression on the other, which add up since they concern the opposite surfaces of the atom nuclei. The condensation of ether in the Sun and the celestial bodies can only come from condensation in the atom nuclei, and probably in elementary particles. The ether is therefore animated by fluxes directed towards the stars. If the ether is incompressible, The speed of these flows is inversely proportional to the square of the distance to the stars in which it condenses. The flow of ether condensation is proportional to the outer surface of the atomic nuclei. For it to be proportional to their mass, it is only necessary that the atom nuclei are bubbles and not solid balls. It would also be necessary for the thickness of these bubbles to be the same for all the atoms. This is not exactly the case. The thickness varies very slightly. This explains the mass defect, the order of magnitude of which is 10 to the minus 24 grams. It is also the order of magnitude of the difference between the inert mass and the heavy mass. The drag of the ether is proportional to the apparent surface of the nuclei of atoms. However, the mass of the nucleus is proportional to their apparent surface. The drag of condensation fluxes from the ether is therefore proportional to the mass of the nuclei of atoms. This is exactly Newton's law.
Another advertisement, unfortunately. I'll try to get rid of it.
But things get more complicated, because ether drag also occurs when nuclei move through ether. The planets should collapse on the sun. Hamilton's principle saves the day. The flow of an ideal gas towards a well is not stable. It rotates. The Hamilton's principle gives the shape of the whirlpool that inevitably forms. This is evident in water and air, but also applies to ether. The stars are therefore surrounded by whirlpools. We obviously think of Descartes. But here the whirlpools have a cause, the condensation of ether and matter. The whirlpool of the sun drags the planets in rotation. The tangential speed of this whirlpool must therefore be proportional to the inverse of the square root of the distance to the sun. Unfortunately, these whirlpools in perfect fluids have a tangential velocity proportional to the inverse of the distance to the center of the whirlpool. This result is taken from the Lagrange equation, the energy equation. But then there is a solution. Ether particles are animated not only by linear Brownian motion, but also by angular momentum. The principle of equipartition of energy exactly doubles the energy term in the Lagrange equation. The solution is then exactly a tangential speed proportional to the inverse of the square root of the distance to the center of the star. These were the velocities of the ether currents. The motions of the stars themselves are obtained by applying Kepler's laws. The planets have no drag in their rotation around the sun, because the ether rotates with them. Whirlpools are the stable form of flows towards a well in application of Hamilton's principle. In application of Poincaré's theorem, the whirlpool is concentrated in a plane which is the main plane of galaxies and the equatorial plane of stars and planets. On each side of this equatorial whirlpool, the ether also condenses so that whirlpools must appear and so on up to the poles. The zones thus formed are separated by eddy cones, giving the zones alternating reverse rotations. This explains the zonal appearance of the planets. The ether rotates the gases that surround the planets. This is the case for Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. The zones formed by these gases themselves cause gas whirlpools by friction at their interfaces, as can be seen up to the pole of Jupiter. Earth's ocean currents are also clearly zonal in nature. The phenomenon is also indisputable for terrestrial winds, although it is less obvious. The rotation of the sun on itself is essentially zonal. Moreover, the small inclinations of the trajectories of comets relative to the equatorial plane of the sun have a clearly zonal distribution. The rotational electric field of the Maxwell-Faraday equation imagined by Maxwell has no effect on the electron beams. This equation does not apply in a vacuum and therefore it cannot in any way represent the propagation of a wave in a vacuum. The Maxwell-Hertz equation is a pure postulate of Maxwell without any experimental justification. Without the Maxwell-Faraday equation it makes no sense. Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic waves is an assumption without any basis. Maxwell's theory, however, provided a solution to the transverse nature of light. On the other hand, its corpuscular nature was incompatible with an ether. It was necessary to invent the double nature of light, wave and particle. Maxwell's double failure brings up the problem of the nature of light.
If you've ever tried to play guitar, but your fingers wouldn't cooperate, it's not your fingers' fault. In fact,
the failure of Maxwell's theory brought relativity in its wake. Maxwell's theory was the only justification for Einstein's theory after the relativistic interpretation of the Michelson and Morley experiment was challenged by Professor Allais. The Michelson and Morley interferometer had detected speeds that can reach 9 kilometers per second. Miller's measurements had highlighted the need for an ether to explain the correlations between the relative motions of the Moon, Earth, and Sun. An ether therefore fills space from the confines of the universe to the very interior of the atoms. It is made up of particles like all fluids. These particles of the ether move in all directions. And they propagate waves like all fluids. The speed of these waves in the ether is the quadratic mean of the speeds of agitation of the particles of the ether. Unlike corpuscles, waves in media can split into two wave trains and interfere. We also get interference with electrons, carbon-60 molecules, and even with large organic molecules. Unlike the waves generated here in the water, these electrons and molecules move at very low speeds compared to the celeridity of light. As a result, the waves they form as they move through the ether precede them. They interfere and cause a distribution of these elements in the space located after the slits. The high-pressure areas push the electrons, atoms, or molecules towards the low pressures which remain aligned in the direction of the bands which form on the receiving device. There is therefore no need for presence probabilities. Whereas, in air and water, the complex shape of molecules cancels their angular momentum when they collide. Particles in ether, simple spheres, can have an angular momentum. The introduction of the angular momentum of the ether particles has an interesting consequence. When two of these particles collide, the momentum is transmitted according to Descartes' laws. This transmission occurs by elastic deformation of the ether particles. The elastic deformation of the ether particles prevents the sliding of the particles one over the other as a result of the flattening of the parts in contact. During the oscillations of the electrons, they transmit their momentum to the particles of the ether, but also their angular momentum. The angular moments can only be transmitted transversely. This feature explains the transverse nature of light. Each wave train is therefore polarized in the orientation of the angular momentum of the emitting electrons. The Orsay experiment, also known as the aspect experiment, therefore poses no problem. The state of polarization is obviously the same for the two symmetrical wave trains emitted by the vibrations of the electrons. There is no need for quantum entanglement. One can observe the polarization of the blue of the sky in the opposite direction to the sun and the double polarization of the K layer of the sun with this instrumented diaphragm tube. If in viscous fluids, waves propagate by dispersing, the same is not true in a medium made up of particles of simple shapes. In water, the dispersion of waves results from the complex shape of the molecules. In the air, the sound is already much more directional. With a megaphone, the sound waves may be concentrated. In the ether, the vibrations of an electron cause two symmetrical wave trains whose transverse surfaces remain invariable over very large distances if the particles of the ether are very regular spheres. In these conditions, they do not drag their neighbors. Such wave trains can therefore have effects analogous to a corpuscle. This is the case of the photoelectric effect. Gravitational waves travel at the speed of light. These waves are also waves of the ether. They are emitted by the movements of the stars at extremely low frequencies below 300 Hz at the same time as light waves which exceed frequencies of 4 to the 14 Hz. The ether has a pressure like all fluids. This pressure is exerted on the nuclei of the atoms and maintains their cohesion. A moving particle in this fluid is subject to a pressure drag. Its lifespan is therefore extended if it is unstable. An atom that moves very quickly in ether is flattened, so it has a modified wavelength in addition to the Doppler effect. Electrons cannot rotate around the nuclei of atoms without their drag in the ether causing them to fall onto the nucleus. In reality, electrons make quantized jumps above the nucleus of atoms. After the ejection of an electron, the nucleus can eject another electron, but with a different energy, since its mass has changed. This explains the Pauli exclusion principle. The rotation of the perfect fluids in the whirlpool very exactly compensates the rotation on themselves of the fluid particles. This flow is irrotational. The same is not true in the ether. The angular kinetic energy of the ether particles doubles the energy term. The rotation of the vortices requires an input of angular kinetic energy. It can only come from the angular kinetic energy of the particles of ether. The rotation of the whirlpool absorbs part of the angular kinetic energy of the particles of the ether. So that, for example, near the sun where the speed of rotation is very high, the law of tangential velocities is no longer exactly the inverse of the square root of the distance. A similar phenomenon occurs for galaxies that do not respect this law either. Their size leads to a very significant decrease in the angular kinetic energy available when approaching their eye. The tangential speed goes from 1 over square root of r to 1 over r according to the red curve. It varies very little over a long distance. There is no need for dark matter. When the rotation of the whirlpool is fast enough, a hole appears in the center. This is the case in water as well as in the atmosphere. The central part of a cyclone is free of clouds, drops of water. You can see it very clearly in the photos taken from space. It is the same with the ether filling the cosmos. The ether condenses in the stars of the galaxies. Swirls must therefore. Galaxies are therefore large whirlpools dragging stars around their eye. And in the center of the galactic whirlpool, a hole can appear if the rotational speed of the whirlpool is large enough. This hole is not free of ether just as a cyclone in the atmosphere is not free of air. The galaxy hole is free of matter, free of atoms, so it appears to be black because there is no emission of light when there are no atoms. It's a black hole. The result is that it could happen that a galaxy located far beyond a black hole could be observed inside the black hole. The ether particles condense into the nuclei of atoms. The nuclei of atoms therefore grow over time. Observed at galactic distances, they must therefore appear to us with shifted spectrum. There is no need to assume that galaxies are moving away from us to explain the Hubble effect. There is no Big Bang. The planets grow progressively larger due to the enlargement of the nuclei of the atoms, but the Earth has a greater density in the center than on the surface. The central part must therefore grow faster and the surface must become distended. It distends mainly in the thinnest areas, at the bottom of the oceans. In addition, there are regular magma eruptions which lower the internal pressure of the Earth. This explains the great mountain ranges that arose from the bottom of ancient seas, volcanoes, and earthquakes.
I need to stop sharing now. I think I do that. Let's see now. Screen sharing was cancelled. Make sure that you share on the modal and not cancel. Yeah. Okay. So I hope I'm back, and I see that we have a number of people in the green room. I think Denny might have been signaling that he wanted to have a word. I'll just check. Yes, he does. So I'll bring him up now. Hello, Denny.
Hi.
I wasn't sure if I was able to get back there.
We couldn't see the video. We only heard the audio.
You couldn't see the video. Goodness me. So when I shared my screen, what did you see? Did you
Just
saw
you,
me?
picture view.
Picture. So it didn't work. Okay. Well, that's rather disappointing, and there was no way for me to check. I wonder, is it worth doing it again, or do you think that you got the gist of it from the audio?
No, I think it would be good to rerun it.
Okay, unless anybody objects. If anybody objects, I won't do that. But okay, now let's make sure that it works this time. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I might actually be better. I will check with you before I start. So instead of sharing screen, suppose I share a video file. Now, I've no video file here. Well, I'd have to download it. Let me see now. Sorry, a bit of messing around here. Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't. Suppose I share my screen. Suppose I share a window now. So Danny, I'll just use you as a check. What are you seeing at the moment? Can you see a little box inside saying
I
choose
see
what
two
to share?
squares. You're in the square on the left, and I'm in the square on the right.
No, that's not what I want. I want something else.
Yeah.
So let's see, Chrome tab maybe. Entire screen. Well, you see, this is what I did before. I put up my screen, which I thought had this video. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll get the URL of the video. I'll copy that. And then I'll try to put that up and see what happens. Now, let me see. Get back to this. I'll share. No, cancel. This is terrible now. Video file. See this work. and then I'll put in the file name. I'll put in the thing, open. It's a pity this wasted 20 minutes rather than just a few minutes. Your browser's having trouble sharing the video. This can happen if the file is invalid. Now that didn't seem to work. So let's go back to the other way of doing it. Share screen, entire window, share. Now, so you can't see John de Climont's screen now, can you, with all the videos there?
No.
Well, what's gone wrong then? I have it in front of me here. It's my screen. This is very odd because we've done this before and it has worked.
They update their system periodically.
Could be that, yes. So I have to do something different this time. But I should be able to share. Suppose I share a window. Suppose I do that. Entire screen. It's the wrong one. This one. Right. Okay, share. Wait a minute now. Can you see it now?
No.
Really? That's
Yeah. Yeah.
you see it now. Okay. So I think, sorry. Thanks very much, Denny. You've saved us. I'm going to play it again. And I'll actually keep you up. So if there's any problem, just shout during the transmission if it's not working. So
Okay.
I can hear you. I'll keep you on the stream.
The Neo-Lucida is an optical drawing aid that lets you trace what you see. It's a modern reinterpretation
of the atoms and maintains their cohesion.
Now we have to go back to the beginning. Okay.
Donegal, Ireland's most northerly.
Maxwell's theory was just a fanciful interpretation of Faraday's and Ampere's experiments. The theory of special relativity has been questioned as soon as Maxwell's electromagnetic theory was eliminated. The Michelson and Morley interferometer had detected speeds that can reach 9 kilometers per second. Professor Allais has nullified the relativistic interpretation of Michelson and Morley's experiment. Miller's measurements highlighted the need for an ether to explain the correlations between the relative motions of the Moon, Earth, and Sun. Finally, Professor Sellery took away all hope from relativists by demonstrating that the theory of special relativity can in no way explain Sagnac's experiment. As a consequence of Sellery's paradox, there can be no relativistic metric of rotation around an axis. The theory of general relativity therefore cannot explain this experience either. Ether particles have an angular momentum. This angular moment explains the polarization of light. This same ether explains gravitation. An ether therefore fills space from the confines of the universe to the very interior of the atoms. It is made up of particles like all fluids. In this ether, the only possible explanation for the result of Professor Allais' analyses is that the ether has flows compatible both mainly with the rotation of the Earth around the Sun and with its own rotation around its axis. The ether must be dragged along with the Earth around the Sun. This drag negates the relative speed of Earth and ether. In order for there to be an effect of the Sun, the ether has to move towards the Sun, condenses in the Sun. There is no other way to explain the shifts measured at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. when the Michelson and Morley interferometer is in a plane containing the Sun and the Earth. This shift is slightly modified by the eccentricity of the Earth's trajectory. There is also a corrective effect in the Earth-Moon direction resulting from the condensation of ether in the Moon. Another corrective effect results from the rotation of the ether around the Earth. The Michelson and Morley interferometer is always in a horizontal plane, therefore perpendicular to the flow of condensation of ether in the Earth. This flow has no effect on the interferometer. Matter is practically empty. The nuclei occupy only the 10th to the 100,000th part of the atoms. For simplicity, the frictions in the ether are neglected. It is a perfect fluid and therefore without fluid drag. It is the paradox of D'Alembert. But it carries waves. It is also an ideal gas. However, there is a pressure drag in ideal gases. In fact, the speed of these ether currents adds to the speed of agitation of the ether particles on the front surface of the atom nuclei, and subtracts at the back. There is thus an overpressure on one side, and a depression on the other, which add up since they concern the opposite surfaces of the atom nuclei. The condensation of ether in the Sun and the celestial bodies can only come from condensation in the atom nuclei, and probably in elementary particles. The ether is therefore animated by fluxes directed towards the stars. If the ether is incompressible, the speed of these flows is inversely proportional to the square of the distance to the stars in which it condenses. The flow of ether condensation is proportional to the outer surface of the atomic nuclei. For it to be proportional to their mass, it is only necessary that the atom nuclei are bubbles and not solid balls. It would also be necessary for the thickness of these bubbles to be the same for all the atoms. This is not exactly the case. The thickness varies very slightly. This explains the mass defect, the order of magnitude of which is 10 to the minus 24 grams. It is also the order of magnitude of the difference between the inert mass and the heavy mass. The drag of the ether is proportional to the apparent surface of the nuclei of atoms. However, the mass of the nucleus is proportional to their apparent surface. The drag of condensation fluxes from the ether is therefore proportional to the mass of the nuclei of atoms. This is exactly Newton's law.
Every year, thousands of children suffer from choking incidents. In just a matter of seconds.
But things get more complicated, because ether drag also occurs when nuclei move through ether. The planets should collapse on the Sun. Hamilton's principle saves the day. The flow of an ideal gas towards a well is not stable. It rotates. The Hamilton's principle gives the shape of the whirlpool that inevitably forms. This is evident in water and air, but also applies to ether. The stars are therefore surrounded by whirlpools. We obviously think of Descartes. But here the whirlpools have a cause, the condensation of ether and matter. The whirlpool of the Sun drags the planets in rotation. The tangential speed of this whirlpool must therefore be proportional to the inverse of the square root of the distance to the Sun. Unfortunately, these whirlpools in perfect fluids have a tangential velocity proportional to the inverse of the distance to the center of the whirlpool. This result is taken from the Lagrange equation, the energy equation. But then there is a solution. Ether particles are animated not only by linear Brownian motion, but also by angular momentum. The principle of equipartition of energy exactly doubles the energy term in the Lagrange equation. The solution is then exactly a tangential speed proportional to the inverse of the square root of the distance to the center of the star. These were the velocities of the ether currents. The motions of the stars themselves are obtained by applying Kepler's laws. The planets have no drag in their rotation around the Sun, because the ether rotates with them. Whirlpools are the stable form of flows towards a well in application of Hamilton's principle. In application of Poincaré's theorem, the whirlpool is concentrated in a plane which is the main plane of galaxies and the equatorial plane of stars and planets. On each side of this equatorial whirlpool, the ether also condenses so that whirlpools must appear and so on up to the poles. The zones thus formed are separated by eddy cones, giving the zones alternating reverse rotations. This explains the zonal appearance of the planets. The ether rotates the gases that surround the planets. This is the case for Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. The zones formed by these gases themselves cause gas whirlpools by friction at their interfaces, as can be seen up to the pole of Jupiter. Earth's ocean currents are also clearly zonal in nature. The phenomenon is also indisputable for terrestrial winds, although it is less obvious. The rotation of the Sun on itself is essentially zonal. Moreover, the small inclinations of the trajectories of comets relative to the equatorial plane of the Sun have a clearly zonal distribution. The rotational electric field of the Maxwell-Faraday equation imagined by Maxwell has no effect on the electron beams. This equation does not apply in a vacuum, and therefore it cannot in any way represent the propagation of a wave in a vacuum. The Maxwell-Hertz equation is a pure postulate of Maxwell without any experimental justification. Without the Maxwell-Faraday equation it makes no sense. Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic waves is an assumption without any basis. Maxwell's theory, however, provided a solution to the transverse nature of light. On the other hand, its corpuscular nature was incompatible with an ether. It was necessary to invent the double nature of light, wave and particle. Maxwell's double failure brings up the problem of the nature of light.
During the 2008 financial crisis, the stock market fell 37%, yet
the failure of Maxwell's theory brought relativity in its wake. Maxwell's theory was the only justification for Einstein's theory after the relativistic interpretation of the Michelson and Morley experiment was challenged by Professor Allais. The Michelson and Morley interferometer had detected speeds that can reach 9 kilometers per second. Miller's measurements had highlighted the need for an ether to explain the correlations between the relative motions of the Moon, Earth, and Sun. An ether therefore fills space from the confines of the universe to the very interior of the atoms. It is made up of particles like all fluids. These particles of the ether move in all directions, and they propagate waves like all fluids. The speed of these waves in the ether is the quadratic mean of the speeds of agitation of the particles of the ether. Unlike corpuscles, waves in media can split into two wave trains and interfere. We also get interference with electrons, carbon-60 molecules, and even with large organic molecules. Unlike the waves generated here in the water, these electrons and molecules move at very low speeds compared to the celeridity of light. As a result, the waves they form as they move through the ether precede them. They interfere and cause a distribution of these elements in the space located after the slits. The high-pressure areas push the electrons, atoms, or molecules towards the low pressures which remain aligned in the direction of the bands which form on the receiving device. There is therefore no need for presence probabilities. Whereas, in air and water, The complex shape of molecules cancels their angular momentum when they collide. Particles in ether, simple spheres, can have an angular momentum. The introduction of the angular momentum of the ether particles has an interesting consequence. When two of these particles collide, the momentum is transmitted according to Descartes' laws. This transmission occurs by elastic deformation of the ether particles. The elastic deformation of the ether particles prevents the sliding of the particles one over the other as a result of the flattening of the parts in contact. During the oscillations of the electrons, they transmit their momentum to the particles of the ether, but also their angular momentum. The angular moments can only be transmitted transversely. This feature explains the transverse nature of light. Each wave train is therefore polarized in the orientation of the angular momentum of the emitting electrons. The Orsay experiment, also known as the aspect experiment, therefore poses no problem. The state of polarization is obviously the same for the two symmetrical wave trains emitted by the vibrations of the electrons. There is no need for quantum entanglement. One can observe the polarization of the blue of the sky in the opposite direction to the sun and the double polarization of the K layer of the sun with this instrumented diaphragm tube. If in viscous fluids, waves propagate by dispersing, the same is not true in a medium made up of particles of simple shapes. In water, the dispersion of waves results from the complex shape of the molecules. In the air, the sound is already much more directional. With a megaphone, the sound waves may be concentrated. In the ether, the vibrations of an electron cause two symmetrical wave trains whose transverse surfaces remain invariable over very large distances if the particles of the ether are very regular spheres. In these conditions, they do not drag their neighbors. Such wave trains can therefore have effects analogous to a corpuscle. This is the case of the photoelectric effect. Gravitational waves travel at the speed of light. These waves are also waves of the ether. They are emitted by the movements of the stars at extremely low frequencies below 300 Hz at the same time as light waves which exceed frequencies of 4 to the 14 Hz. The ether has a pressure like all fluids. This pressure is exerted on the nuclei of the atoms and maintains their cohesion. A moving particle in this fluid is subject to a pressure drag. Its lifespan is therefore extended if it is unstable. An atom that moves very quickly in ether is flattened, so it has a modified wavelength in addition to the Doppler effect. Electrons cannot rotate around the nuclei of atoms without their drag in the ether causing them to fall onto the nucleus. In reality, electrons make quantized jumps above the nucleus of atoms. After the ejection of an electron, the nucleus can eject another electron, but with a different energy, since its mass has changed. This explains the Pauli exclusion principle. The rotation of the perfect fluids in the whirlpool very exactly compensates the rotation on themselves of the fluid particles. This flow is irrotational. The same is not true in the ether. The angular kinetic energy of the ether particles doubles the energy term. The rotation of the vortices requires an input of angular kinetic energy. It can only come from the angular kinetic energy of the particles of ether. The rotation of the whirlpool absorbs part of the angular kinetic energy of the particles of the ether. So that, for example, near the sun where the speed of rotation is very high, the law of tangential velocities is no longer exactly the inverse of the square root of the distance. A similar phenomenon occurs for galaxies that do not respect this law either. Their size leads to a very significant decrease in the angular kinetic energy available when approaching their eye. The tangential speed goes from 1 over square root of r to 1 over r according to the red curve. It varies very little over a long distance. There is no need for dark matter. When the rotation of the whirlpool is fast enough, a hole appears in the center. This is the case in water as well as in the atmosphere. The central part of a cyclone is free of clouds, drops of water. You can see it very clearly in the photos taken from space. It is the same with the ether filling the cosmos. The ether condenses in the stars of the galaxies. Swirls must therefore. Galaxies are therefore large whirlpools dragging stars around their eye. And in the center of the galactic whirlpool, a hole can appear if the rotational speed of the whirlpool is large enough. This hole is not free of ether just as a cyclone in the atmosphere is not free of air. The galaxy hole is free of matter, free of atoms, so it appears to be black because there is no emission of light when there are no atoms. It's a black hole. The result is that it could happen that a galaxy located far beyond a black hole could be observed inside the black hole. The ether particles condense into the nuclei of atoms. The nuclei of atoms therefore grow over time. Observed at galactic distances, they must therefore appear to us with a shifted spectrum. There is no need to assume that galaxies are moving away from us to explain the Hubble effect. There is no Big Bang. The planets grow progressively larger due to the enlargement of the nuclei of the atoms, but the Earth has a greater density in the center than on the surface. The central part must therefore grow faster and the surface must become distended. It distends mainly in the thinnest areas, at the bottom of the oceans. In addition, there are regular magma eruptions which lower the internal pressure of the Earth. This explains the great mountain ranges that arose from the bottom of ancient seas, volcanoes, and earthquakes.
I pray that it worked that time. I'm going to, good. I'm going to stop screen, I think. Okay, so we're probably back to normal. Now, did you want to say anything, Denny? Because if you did, I'll keep you up.
This is quite different than anything I've seen before. I'll say that.
Sorry, I didn't get that. It's what that you didn't see before?
Different.
It's something different.
Quite different. Yeah.
Quite different. Yes, quite so. Okay. Well, we've actually absorbed the time that a speaker would have absorbed. So I thought we might be looking at about 3 videos. But maybe it was fortuitous that thing didn't work in the first place because it gave us an opportunity of going through it a second time, which is no harm perhaps because there's a lot of information there. So maybe I might just bring you down, Denny, and before asking others in the green room, I'll just check because a lot of comments have been coming in, and I just check what they've said. But in the meantime, if anybody in the green room wants to come up urgently, just wave at me. So let's see what people have been saying. Good, bad, and well, maybe just before doing that, as moderator, I should just say a couple of things, maybe controversial or not. But I thought there was a lot in that video. And now I have looked at it before, so that's my 3rd time looking at it. And even then, I could maybe go back and look at it again. But he's saying a lot of things like ether explains gravitation. Well, I don't know. maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. He mentions this man Elias, whom I have come across before, but some of the basic points about an ether being carried by the Earth in its solar orbit and so on, and you know, the impossibility of explaining the Sagnac effect by conventional special relativity. I think those are things that many of us, well, I certainly could agree with that. But when he goes on to things like the condensation and the ether moving towards the sun and so on, I think he goes through all that very, very, very quickly. And, you know, one is not convinced from the short video. The other thing about it's odd that the basic Maxwell electromagnetic induction following Faraday's empirical work, he said, doesn't apply in vacuum, and therefore didn't apply to the old type of a cathode ray tube. I found that a bit hard to fathom. And he even talks about getting rid of the necessity for postulating quantum entanglement. He then goes on to look at whirlpools and so on, and fluids and all this, and he gives positive properties of the ether, and he says that explains whirlpool galaxies. Well, that's something that I might take issue with, because you know, I've postulated in the past that maybe what we're seeing is actually a composite image. It's not actually a real image when we get whirlpool galaxies, and we have to explain the you know, the non-adherence of the velocity variation with regard to distance from the center, the non-conformance of that with Newtonian views, and there are various theories which have been given. But you know, I look at the whirlpool as being an apparent composition of different aspects of the galaxy, you know, at different periods of time reaching us. That's something we might discuss. The last thing, you know, the Einstein business, you know, I suppose the Lorentz transformations would render the Maxwell equations invariant, and Einstein just generalizes those and uses them for everything in ordinary kinematics or kinetics or dynamics. But and therefore he indicates a compatibility with Maxwell. But if it hadn't been for Maxwell, Einstein could still create this this theory, which I think many of us would have problems with. So I'm not quite sure if maybe putting the blame, if that's the right word, on Maxwell is right. Those were just some comments I have. I think there's a lot of information there, and he's stating a lot of things without maybe going into establishing them. But on the other hand, can one do that in a 20-minute video? Yeah, sorry, I have a lot of comments here. Had I read them, people telling me that they couldn't see the video, and I apologize to Franklin and Roger and Martin and so on. So there, a lot of people, I wasn't looking at the comments. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So let me see. Ether is not in space. Space, the shadow of the ether. Ether is not in space. Space is the shadow of the ether. Well, that's maybe philosophical comment. I've tried sending email to him. The StreamYard isn't. Yeah. People just were sending me emails. I wasn't reading my emails, and I wasn't reading the comments. My apologies. My only justification is that I was trying to give my full attention to the video, but I do apologize for the first 20 minutes where you were all complaining. Well, you know, this is saying what I was saying in a much stronger way. Andrew Castro, he says, this is just proclamation, zero supporting evidence. Yeah, I think he's making a lot of statements, you know, which you see a lot of people do, saying things. You can say anything. Now, maybe he couldn't do it in a 20-minute video, but I certainly have a lot of sympathy with what Andrew there is saying. Chinlade, what is the speaker's view on the ether, pro or con? I think he believes there is an ether. It's pro ether apparently. Yeah, this is what the people are saying in the comments. Ether does not fill space. Absurd. Does that mean you don't expect the ether at all. This is just between peoples. Franklin, why is it absurd that ether fills space? Is it absurd that space fills ether? Is it absurd to say that air fills? I'm really questioning more his idea of condensation, movement of the ether towards the sun. And he says that maybe the whole solar system would collapse were this not so. This may be a statement rather than something he can prove. I didn't say that. Space is the absence of anything. Ether is pure potential inertial. Space is the absence of potential and the shadow of loss. These are statements, not really questions. Space isn't the absence of anything. Specifically, outer space is pretty complex. Hey, I haven't ever heard any explanation of how ether is composed of tiny particles moving all directions. Yeah. I mean, Jerry says this. I haven't heard any explanation of how ether is composed of tiny particles moving in all directions. What evidence is there for this? Personally, I've been very reluctant to ascribe properties to the ether. I think maybe it's a bit too early. We have to establish its existence in the first place. But maybe things like Simone's lattice structure of ether would be one thing that, Jerry, you might want to look at. But by the way, I'm going through these comments fairly quickly because there are a lot of comments here, and I want to give all of you in the green room time to come in. But if, as I go through them, you have any other comments, just please raise your hands, because I'm just trying to answer them very quickly. What about Higgs boson field claimed and allegedly proven by mainstream physics? Surely this must fill space according to their theory. Well, you'd have to ask them. We probably don't accept much of that. Ether was not a particle either, as we just said earlier. Jerry, any particle matter like air or water, all particles move in one direction. I'd say that is very strong evidence. Look at the definition of space. It is unoccupied. I was actually an author of a Higgs paper. I wouldn't think water particles move all around in opposite directions if the water isn't stirred up. Space is unoccupied by tangible atomic matter. There could be other matter which are difficult to detect. Neutral charged particles are almost impossible to detect. Electrons are not particles. Even J.J. Thomson, I think he means, admitted they were a mathematical representation of a terminal point of dielectric induction. Have you heard of the Higgs fake? Yeah, that's been mentioned before. I think by David de Hilster in the other talks, and he has actually interviewed. Unsecker about that. But I think you're getting to what is a vacuum in physics, even if a pump out there. Yeah, I'll have to speed up because there's so many comments coming in. I haven't looked at them at all. Explain that, describe. Can you call Ian on phone and SMS? I think that was probably because they couldn't hear anything. Do Higgs particles fix space? Every fundamental particle is a resonance. Okay. Religion is a binding of the mind. You do not have to be a Christian or Buddhist to have a religion. Science has become a religion today. How far? I believe the Big Bang. Well, let's see this now. Andrew Castro, which I agreed with him earlier on this. Let's see. I believe in the Big Bang and am not religious. In fact, my thesis was on using heavy ion collisions at CERN to probe possibly the thermodynamics of the Big Bang. Yeah, well, I'm sure there are religious people who believe in the Big Bang, and there are atheists who believe in the Big Bang. So it's just so generally believed in, and I think many of us, including myself, contest it fundamentally. On StreamYard, you just have to select your. Yeah, he was telling me how to do that. I see what you're saying, Bob and Anne. Religion comes from the word religare, which is Latin, where that means to bind together. That's true. The term you used, your definition of religion, fundamental particle dimensionless. I suppose the point would be the definition of vacuum as being absolutely nothing would be wrong for those who believe in the ether. Yeah, that's probably true. Many of us think that nothing cannot exist. It might be a bit of a contradiction in terms. See, as I get through these, more comments are coming in. So I'm not winning. I'm going to have to hurry up a bit now because we've taken more than an hour of the talk. On the crane, electron is an energy pattern, blah, blah, blah. So those people in the putting the comments in, if you really want us to address something and maybe try to answer it, please just put question, because most of these are just comments between yourselves, which is part of the talk. I'm not objecting to that. In fact, I encourage you to do it. J.J. Thomson's concept of the electron, his own discovery, considered the electron the terminal end of a dielectric. He said that before. Yeah, electron scanning. See now. Okay, here's something. Let me see on the video. It seems to me that Jean de Clement's Aether is the bullets of the ballistic theory of Walter Ritz. Am I on the right track with this analogy? I don't think you are, but I couldn't say. He hasn't really addressed this. Because I've been involved recently with looking at some information, the information coming from Alfred O'Rahilly, who wrote in 1938 this book on electromagnetics, which seems quite fundamental, and he raised a lot of points which I think many of us would agree with. But he also seems to accept the Ritz ballistic theory. So I think O'Rahilly might be doing that rather than de Clement. We can put it to him if necessary. That's just my guess. Has anyone seen solid electrons? Electrons point to terminals, electron microscopes. Philosophers, Egyptian philosophers. But everything in the whirlpool gets sucked into the center, so planets should get sucked in as well. Yeah, he's trying to deal with some of these points. Franklin makes a stark statement. I think it's not new because I've heard him say things like this before. Yes, Maxwell Faraday has no experimental confirmation. Well, all I would say is Faraday was an experimenter, so most of his things do have experimental confirmation. Maybe the interpretation is wrong, or maybe I think Franklin would possibly say, and I see Franklin has joined the green room, so we can bring him up soon, but I think Franklin might say that the Maxwell interpretation of that doesn't have justification. With the sun's gravity, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, okay. Philip E. Mason is a British chemist and a YouTuber with the online pseudonym Thunder. He's best known for his critiques of religion, pseudoscience, and creationism. But by the way, I understand that Jean de Clement, that's a pseudonym as well. And I was trying to get his real name just before coming online, but I didn't manage to get it. But I think he was a lecturer, an academic lecturer, and his field was on things like fluid dynamics and so on. But I think Jean de Clement is just his nom de guerre, which he would use to get onto the publicity media that we have today. He said Clement believes in length contraction. I didn't see that, or I didn't see the converse. You can make David Blaine made the Statue of Liberty disappear. I saw that as well. Well, yeah, it doesn't mean it isn't conjuring, perhaps. Okay, what that means involved. It doesn't mean seeing isn't the truth. Okay, a lot of comments. We're going to have to cut those out now because they're just coming in, which is fine. Okay, Big Bang was never right. Big Bang. Now, okay, I'll just have a look at the private chat if you give me just a moment, because you're probably telling me that you couldn't see anything. Yeah, can't see video. Can't see video. Ian, Nick Purcell, we just see you. Yeah, he was saying the same. When you share, yeah, okay. If I'd read these, I probably could have resolved the situation. Also, when you share the screen, you need to share the audio. We did hear the audio, so maybe that's already. Playing it again is a good idea. Yeah, and Jim Morrison, can you show his MMX in space video? Yeah. I support that. It should be done, although I don't agree with his reasons for proposing it. Well, and Jim is there, so we'll possibly bring him up in a minute as well. I was thinking of showing that as the second video, because he's saying that there are problems in doing the Michelson-Morley experiment on Earth. And I know Jim has views on this as well. But I think I'm going to defer to the views of most of you on this, because I think we're running out of time. And I think if we did that, there mightn't be sufficient time for discussion. So I think what we might do is I might ask a few of you on the green room to give your responses. And if there's any time, we'll go and spend that looking at the other video. So, so can I bring you up, Jim, maybe on that? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear.
Great. Actually, the one point, since we can only do kind of short concept ideas, he said there's no need for dark matter.
Yeah.
I'd like to point out that if there is an ether and it's made out of particles, and those particles have mass, that maybe that's what dark matter is, and that since it's the medium for transmitting electromagnetic waves, that's why you can't see it in terms of detecting that it emits anything, any detectable radiation. And further, if you assume that the density of the ether is proportional to the local gravitational potential, that would explain why it's distributed in a inversely proportional to distance as measured originally in galaxies, as measured originally by Vera Rubin. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, just the first thing about the dark matter and so on. He seems to say that the black hole is maybe a bit of an illusion. There's something there. What was claimed to have been photographed recently, in the last year or two, was something real, but he has an alternative explanation for it. Now, I know we've talked about hoaxes and twisting data around, but that's another thing. When you're talking about this variation with distance, are you talking about things like the speed of rotation of the arms of the galaxy as well, Jim?
Well, that's what was one of the original detections of something going wrong with the velocities of stars at the edges of galaxies.
Was Vera Rubin involved in that years ago?
Yeah, she was the one that discovered that. She's actually given credit for it.
Okay.
Although Zwicky essentially proposed it from his measurement of the velocity of galaxies and galaxy clusters before that.
Okay.
But she actually showed a correspondence with distance from the center of the galaxies. I'm just wondering if you ever heard anybody try to, if anybody's heard of anybody that's tried to propose that the density of dark matter is related to gravitational potential, and if that's been shot down.
Which is quite possibly what de Clement is saying.
No, he's saying that the ether rotates around the galaxy, and that drags the planets or stars, but that doesn't explain why anything orbiting off the main axis, ecliptic or whatever, of the galaxy or our solar system behaves just the same way as in terms of orbital velocity, that like comets that are orbit around the top of the pole, the poles of the sun. So I think that idea is totally bogus.
Right. He did claim, just in passing, that the Newton's universal law came out of the wash. I think he was sort of saying that. But anyway, we could look at that in more detail. Okay.
I also like that he pointed out that LA showed that special relativity could not explain Sagnac.
Yeah.
That's a very important point that people just gloss over.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the wiki, you know, I know it's changing daily, maybe, but if you look at that, to me, it's so strange that they're just, you know, using any sort of argument that could be twisted around to indicate, instead of looking at the hard fact that it obviously contradicts special relativity. Well, that's my view as well, so we agree on that. And he did state it. He did state it, and Elias he did as well. Have you looked at that MMX video of his, by the way? And do you know how long it takes to play?
I think it was actually relatively short, like 10 minutes or so. But,
okay, so I maybe we'll get to play it. I tell you what I'll do. I'll just take you down.
Well,
Jim.
it was just a thought. Yeah, I mean, his ideas for proposing it, I think are totally bogus. But I think it's great that at least he supports that idea of doing it. I mean, we need
support the proposal.
That's the key experiment
that you don't agree with. That's fair enough. Well, let me just check.
Blow up relativity.
Yeah, I'll take you down, Jim, and I'll just check how long that takes. And we'll either play that and then ask others up, or if
maybe another time, you know.
Yeah, if it's less than 10 minutes, perhaps I can play it. But I think if it's more than that, I won't. So let me just see now. I'm making these executive decisions, but you can complain if you wish. So let me see. I'm not sharing it. I'm just looking at the screen now. Jean de Clement. Einstein and Maxwell theory. That's 9 minutes, but that's very mathematical. The problem of Einstein, famous 1905 paper, it only takes 6 minutes. Actually, he's got a lot there, and I think what I should do, actually, instead of keeping this all to myself, I'm going to copy. I'm going to paste the URL in the chat. I don't know. I probably it's in there now. Let me see. I think that's going to the private chat. Can I put it into the public one as well? Make a comment. Yeah, I'm going to put it in both the private and the public, so you can all look for it for yourselves. And there was one video, problems in the 1905 paper, and so on. But let's continue the discussion for a little while, because I fear that we'd have no time left if we had a look at one of those. I think maybe I'll ask Franklin up now, with your permission, because you've made a couple of comments, Franklin, and perhaps you'd elaborate on this business. I know you fundamentally take issue with the whole concept of the electromagnetic transverse wave coming out of the Maxwell equations and so on.
Yeah, I'm interested in this talk because, recently I was watching another one of Jean Clement's videos, specifically on this whole thing about relativity, the 1905 paper, and the Maxwell-Faraday equation. So, but what he did in his other video was he actually showed an experiment where he was shooting an electron beam across an area which has magnetic coils in it. So his assertion was that Maxwell-Faraday's equation says that a changing magnetic field will create an actual real electric field. So that's not an unreasonable experimental expectation. So what he observed was that, when you shoot the electron beam through, he said that you would expect that if the electric field was actually being created by the changing magnetic field, then that would increase the deflection of the beam. So as you turned on the electromagnet, you should see the beam deflect more until the magnetic field stabilizes, and then it would go back to just a normal, just pure magnetic deflection. And his experimental result was that really didn't happen. So that would be, if it did deflect more, then that would be a confirmation that there was an actual electric field being generated. So now I'm not 100% sure about that, because you've got mixed magnetic and electric fields happening at the same time. How can you tell that, that maybe the electric field is compensated with magnetic field that's happening at the same time? But at least I feel that was an attempt to try and prove or disprove Maxwell-Faraday. Now, as you mentioned, the original Faraday's formula, I believe, is correct, which is relating an EMF, which is a current in a wire caused by a magnet movement, right? So we have good experimental confirmation of Faraday's law, but what we don't have actually any experimental confirmation of would be Maxwell/Faraday's law, as is found in the Maxwell's equations. So the third and fourth equations are the things that allow us to say that a changing magnetic field creates an electric field, like a real electric field, and that a changing electric field creates a magnetic field. And I agree with Clement in that there isn't actually, for as well accepted as these equations are, zero experimental evidence that those things can happen in free space. And that's what Jean Clement is complaining about, is that those equations can happen, but they can only happen inside of real wires containing real electrons. And so since free space has no such wires and no electrons, then it really can't apply, which I would also agree as well. What's been experimentally verified is like plain Faraday's law. When you use real magnets, real wires, real electrons. But it's not at all justified that this sort of thing can just happen in free vacuum space. I mean, I've been discussing with this. I mean, it's a spectacular claim that we can have an electric field which is present without any charges being visible anywhere, right? It says if the electric field can leap off the electron and travel infinite distances, a billion light years across empty space, even though the electron that created it is, a billion light years away, right? That's an extraordinary claim.
But isn't this why we introduced the concept of a medium in the first place?
Well, see, the thing is that what the Maxwell's equations do is they allow you to deny the existence of an ether, because if you can figure that the light wave, the most obvious solution for a light wave is that it travels as a wave in the medium, but mainstream science, it rejects the ether, but you still have to have some explanation for how the light wave gets there. So what they do is they invoke the magnetic and electric field as being this magical thing that can take the place of the ether, really. Kind of like the point I was making, that as long as people believe the Maxwell-Faraday equation, they don't need to believe in an ether. So they have an out, right? So that's why I keep on trying to prove repeatedly that, if you tried to do things like just measure the magnetic field in an EM wave, and I suggest doing it by using a Hall effect sensor, which works by actually sending an electron between a small gap. So it's very much like the electron beam, which is what Jean Clement was trying to do. He shows that electron beam is not affected. There's no actual, say, magnetic field or electric field there. And
but I didn't understand that. I mean, this is the basis of a cathode ray tube. What's he saying? That if you put electric and magnetic fields and you have an evacuated tube, that it doesn't actually influence the electrons. I wasn't quite clear what he's getting at.
Well, what he's getting at is that if the Maxwell-Faraday equation were true, then real electric fields would be generated that would affect the deflection of the CRT beam. But he's saying that just doesn't happen. It's a direct prediction of Maxwell Faraday's equation, and when you test it, it's just not true. There's no measurable electric field present in the experiment that he was doing, which there should be. A variable magnetic field should create variable electric field. Those two should add together and create a different deflection, but they don't. So that would be a direct refutation of the Maxwell Faraday equation. At least, like I said, I'm not 100% convinced that that experiment he produced actually does that, but I am convinced that that magnetic fields, variable magnetic fields, do not generate in any way an electric field. That has never, ever been experimentally demonstrated. Never. So that, there's been no direct demonstration of the Maxwell Faraday equation experimentally, other than saying that, well, we observe radio waves and that proves it, right? But that's completely circular logic. I mean, if that's the only evidence that you have that those equations work, then you're just assuming.
You won't be surprised to say that to understand that Harry has put a statement in that saying you're basically saying that radio waves are impossible.
No, I don't say radio waves. No, that I want to emphasize that. Of course, I am not saying that radio waves don't exist. I mean, that's ridiculous to say that. I'm just saying that, I've had an argument with Stephen Gift. It's like, oh, you don't think radio waves exist? I said, no, that's absurd. What we're arguing about are the details of the radio signal. For example, my personal belief is that radio signals happen by conduction, which just and that's just like the same thing how a wave travels in a piece of wire, right? It's just things that are you got a wave in there because you have electron gas in the wire. It gets compressed and rarefied. And I'm just saying that when the wave goes through the wire, it hits the medium, which I think is an ether, and the ether vibrates, and it does exactly the same thing. And when it hits the receiving antenna, it vibrates in sympathy, and that's how we see the emergence of the current. I mean, that's a much simpler picture than having the radio wave become this 90-degree to each other magnetic and electric field, which is, again, I reminded people the three things you cannot measure in an electric field, which you should, which is you have to be able to measure the 90-degree orientation of the magnetic and electric planes. You need to verify that the electric and magnetic fields are in phase, and you should be able to measure the independent electric and magnetic fields. That's why if you use something that can only measure magnetic field, like a Hall effect sensor, you would never, ever be able to actually receive a radio wave, because, I would claim there is no magnetic field to be detected. And you cannot use a Hall effect sensor to receive a radio signal. At least that would be my prediction, because it just doesn't exist. But if the if Maxwell Faraday was true, then yes, you would be able to easily receive a radio wave using a Hall effect sensor. But I just don't think you can. But that's my opinion.
If for what it's worth, I'm just always a little cautious of engaging in physical explanations. We probably think differently in this respect, Frank, to a certain extent, because I'm actually happier with the mathematical formulation, because what I'm doing is maybe, a series of experiments with Faraday that Faraday has undertaken. And he has found certain results coming from, we won't call them very magnetic fields, but we'll call them from various geometries which vary the cutting of the lines, if you like. I'm trying to avoid using ordinary language, and yet I'm using ordinary language. But he's given certain results which will flow from transformer induction as against motional induction, and those are the equations which would actually quantify those. So we take them. But when you start interpreting them in particular ways, I then have problems. Not only with your interpretation, but with the mainstream interpretation as well. So perhaps it's something we can get back to. I know we've discussed unipolar induction and all that, and all these questions have come up then, and I know you have strong views on those. So so maybe if that's all, Franklin, for the moment, we can.
Yeah. But once again, like Harry is saying that, so Franklin says magnetic fields do not exist, and no, that is definitely not what I'm saying. I'm saying that a variable magnetic field does not create an electric field. Okay, Harry, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that electric fields or magnetic fields do not exist. If you're using that to try to just dismiss what I'm saying, then I want to clarify that no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying Maxwell-Faraday law, Maxwell's equations is not experimentally verified. I mean, that's a really mysterious thing. That none of what's in the EM equation has any experimental verification at all. Now, once again, somehow you're interpreting that as meaning that, I don't believe in magnetic waves or magnetic or electric fields. It's like, yeah, they exist, but I'm saying they have nothing to do with the transmission of light, is what I'm saying.
People are a bit confused because MC says that he's addressing this to Harry. He said, he, probably you, Franklin, said that magnetic field of light doesn't exist, not that magnetic fields don't exist. So, he's applying what you're saying to light, but I think you're saying generally, you don't think that what we call the Faraday induction law, or the Maxwell-Faraday induction law, is correct. I say it's basically correct, given some, constraints and qualifications.
Well, clarification: Faraday's law, which just says Faraday, which involves an EMF. When you use a wire, you observe a magnet. Absolutely true. But when you take away the magnets and the wires, absolutely false, which is what Maxwell-Faraday allows you to do. It equates an EMF, which is an actual, there's something which causes the electrons to be forced in one direction. Just like when you see electrons being deflected in a CRT. That's EMF. There's something forcing the electron down. And then you're confusing that and equating it to an electric field, which doesn't exist.
Yeah, but as Harry has pointed out here, Hertz's experiments could be viewed as a verification of the application of the Maxwell equations. Now, you have your own explanation that it's conduction or something, but, we're not taking a rabbit out of a hat. We're actually inducing these fields from, real phenomena, real electrons flowing in wires and real magnetic fields and so on. And Hertz's experiments producing the electron. I think Harry's saying the same thing as I'm saying. He says, I proved Franklin wrong many times because Marconi detected radio waves using a magnetic detector.
Yes, a magnetic detector in a sense, like you have a multimeter, which has a little meter. And the reason why you can detect a radio wave with that meter is because it sends a current through the loop, which has a magnet. And yes, then you can see the meter wave back and forth. But you see, that's detecting the current. That doesn't detect the actual magnetic field. If you were to be able to detect the magnetic field, you'd have to use something like a squid detector or a Hall effect sensor. See, that's how you can detect the magnetic field without technically invoking the induction effect, right? Or you can detect it like Clement did, which is by just sending an electron beam across vacuum space. Those should all be influenced by electric and magnetic fields without, necessarily using a wire. See, the problem is that we can't tell what happens between the transmitter and the receiver. All we know is we send the signal to the transmitter, we receive back the same signal in the receiver. That's just how it got there. That's the question of the debate.
Yeah, that's right. We're developing various physical models which, might tie in with our own preconceived ideas. That's the problem. I've actually invited Harry to come up on the green room because it's rather difficult to, I don't want to take sides really too much here, but
yeah, you should let someone else talk. I've talked too much, so.
Yeah, I was going to bring you down in a moment anyway, but if Harry comes in, we may continue this. So thanks anyway for that contribution. I'll bring you down now, Franklin. And I'm wondering, does James Keane have anything to say? Just really your I suppose your response to some of these discussions about Jean de Clement's work and maybe the fundamental aspects that are accepted daily. We can't hear you. No, you have to unmute yourself, Jim. You have to do that.
Here we go.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, okay, Ian. I didn't have any particular comments, but I might make the observation that it's sort of troubling in a video like we saw that so many ideas are thrown out without any kind of operational definition. And in science, in order to do experiments on any of these things, we need to operationally define all of these things, like these particles, descending into the sun, and good goodness, all of these ideas lack definition in terms of at least an operational definition of this concept. I will measure in this way and proceed from there. That's what science is all about. But I don't have any particular comments beyond that critique of the lack of operational definition of terms. In other words, people can sort of say anything they want, but that's not science. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. You've expressed maybe slightly more strongly the views that I actually held as well, and it's just that having
correct
maybe exchange a couple of emails with John de Clement, I think actually there is something there, but I think maybe there's an excuse that in a reasonably short video he wasn't able to provide all those definitions. But I agree that they would be desirable, to say the least.
Yes.
And maybe some of you, Jim, in your spare time, can look at some of those videos and maybe at a later stage give us some feedback. That would be appreciated, because this is actually a short session, and it degenerated. Well, that's maybe a bit of a loaded word, but it's concentrated a bit on the debate between Franklin and Harry with regard to whether the fundamental work of Maxwell in interpreting Faraday's laws was correct or not. So thanks very much for that, Jim, and that's very valuable. It's a good insight into what we're doing now. If you'd like, I have had a brief chat with all of you. I think only one or two volunteered. I brought you all up. You've had your say. And a couple of comments are coming in that maybe we might have a look at one or two of the other videos. So maybe if you'd like me to play that 6-minute video on the Einstein paper, or maybe the theoretical one on the equations, I'll try not to mess it up this time. I think we have time for a 6-minute video. Let me just see where we are now. Present, share screen. Now, I'm going to select a tab here. I want window. Yeah, that's share now. So what I'll do this time is I'll get this thing up, maybe I can share. So I'm now in the system, and the two videos, I'm interested in this Einstein and Maxwell theory, because that's 9 minutes. It's a bit mathematical, but I think it might, to a certain extent, answer some of or attempt to answer some of the points that Franklin was raising. The other one, which I think some people were interested in, was what's wrong with the 2 errors in Einstein's 1905. That's only 3 minutes. We might actually have time for both, so with your permission, maybe I'll have a look at this theoretical paper, see what he says about Einstein and Maxwell and Faraday and so on. 9 minutes. So here it goes. I'll maximize it. I hope you can all see that now.
After Newton, the positivists imposed the idea that the purpose of physics was to find the mathematical equations corresponding to experiments. In their totalitarian approach, the positivists, and then the progressives asserted that all the forces of nature should be unified in a single force, gravitation. Maxwell began by proposing a unification of the electric and magnetic forces carried by an ether, also carrying the light waves. He gave the equations summarizing the corresponding phenomena. This immobile ether filled the entire universe. It was a solid because light can be polarized and therefore has a transverse property. A few years later, Hertz carried out an experiment showing that the waves produced by an electric arc propagate at the speed of light. Maxwell's theory thus received a striking confirmation. Another experiment dealt a terrible blow to Maxwell's ether. Michelson's experiment showed that the Earth has no motion compared to Maxwell's ether, which is solid and motionless. Lorentz therefore imagined that the lengths would get longer and time would slow down with speed. A motion in the motionless ether filling the universe would alter lengths and time. Lorentz's ether replaced Maxwell's. Maxwell's equations were saved. A second blow to Maxwell's system was dealt by Poincaré. The equations that governed the propagation of light and electromagnetic waves were not invariant in a Galilean frame change. Poincaré had imagined that the equations of electromagnetic phenomena should remain identical for two observers moving relative to each other at constant speed. Poincaré's physics dealt only with essential things. Its principle of relativity is absurd in fluids like water and air. One absolutely do not measure the same thing from a bridge over a river as in a boat carried by its current. This is not at all what Poincaré was interested with. It is a question of theoretical physics, of pure science, and in no case of vulgar engineering techniques. A brilliant intuition led Einstein to verify that the Lorentz transformation modifying lengths and time during motions in the ether made it possible to respond to Poincaré's criticism. The Maxwell-Faraday and Maxwell-Hertz equations that govern wave propagation in the motionless Lorentz ether remain the same for all observers moving at constant speed in the Lorentz ether. The Lorentz transformation saved the ether by both explaining Michelson's experiment and fulfilling Poincaré's principle of relativity. Einstein's theory was naturally named theory of relativity. Maxwell's equations were saved. A page of history seems to have been definitively turned. Professor William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, believed that physics was practically complete. There is nothing left to discover in physics today. All that remains is to improve the accuracy of measurements. However, at the very moment when Kelvin imagined the end of science, Planck realized that light is quantized. His famous experiment on black bodies allowed him to affirm that light is made of quanta. Planck thus answered the problem posed by the photoelectric effect discovered by Hertz. The blow was fatal for the ether. No medium was known having properties quantified in this way. Light and electromagnetic waves are therefore carried by corpuscles, photons. Maxwell's equations were still saved. Another stroke of genius brought the solution to this kind of paradox. Louis de Broglie posed the double nature of light, wave and corpuscle. However, how to conceive that corpuscles can produce interferences? It was necessary to add the probability of presence of photons, as waves, but of course localized, as corpuscles, as soon as they are in contact with matter. Another tragedy occurred a few decades after these trying upheavals. Photons emitted in opposite directions remain informed of their polarization state when they arrive at the receiver. They invented quantum entanglement. Yet despite all these upheavals, for more than 150 years, Maxwell's equations emerged unscathed. The multitudes of theories proposed since then remain with the unshakable equations of Maxwell. Maxwell's equations were saved again and again. What professor did not feel a bit embarrassed to point out that the complementary term of the Maxwell-Ampere equation, the famous displacement current, is not based on any experimental fact. This complementary term crystallized all the critics. Nobody imagined that it was just a consequence of another equation, the Maxwell-Faraday equation. Maxwell imagined that the electric current induced in a conductor by a varying magnetic field resulted from an electric field produced by the variation of the magnetic field. The unification of electric and magnetic forces made this idea perfectly plausible. The change from a magnetic field to an electric field occurred in a physical medium that could perhaps be modified in some way. Since the ether has been eradicated, how can it be conceived that the variation of a magnetic field can be transmuted into an electric field? However, this electric field should accelerate the electrons of an electron beam from a cathode ray tube, in a vacuum therefore. Such a phenomenon has never been observed. Maxwell's interpretation of Faraday's experiment is totally wrong. There is no electric field. The variation of the magnetic field acts directly on the conductors to produce a current. The Maxwell-Faraday equation only makes sense in conductors. The change in the intrinsic magnetic fields of protons, neutrons, and electrons generates a current in conductors. But then the complementary term of the Maxwell-Ampere equation is also false. The conservation of the charge requires eliminating this term, the displacement current, since the Maxwell-Faraday equation disappears. There is no equation left that would correspond to the propagation of waves in space. Maxwell's whole electromagnetic theory collapses. The Maxwell equations are eradicated. Einstein's theory of special relativity could well be dragged into the turmoil. Because the most serious thing is that Michelson's experiment, repeated thousands of times by Miller, not only does not give entirely negative results, but in addition they are correlated with the respective positions of the Sun, the Earth, and the Moon. The totalitarian vision of the progressives was a dark illusion. This absurd vision was also based on a profound contradiction. The progressives quite rightly proposed an evolution of the universe. But they based this evolution on a multitude of constants that were strictly invariant over billions of light years. Everything evolves, even atoms. Everything differentiates, even forces.
Let's see, can I return now? To stop sharing. Stop screen. Okay, I think we're back there. Actually, Bob Gray was in the green room at the beginning of the conference, but I think he's gone now. I'd like to hear some of his views on what Franklin was saying, because it appears to me that Franklin actually would probably agree with a lot of de Clemont's ideas. He's sort of like tearing down, iconoclastically tearing down Maxwell's ideas and explaining that they aren't the basis of radio waves, and radio waves exist, but that's another matter altogether. A lot of the equations go and so on. So actually, incidentally, some of the archives that I was looking at of this chap Alfred O'Rahilly, he's somewhat critical of Maxwell's views as well. He tends to concern himself a bit more with the continental physicist. I've forgotten his name, Durkin or something like that. Contemporaneous, maybe middle of the 19th century. Okay, the comments are still coming in. Thanks for the show, but I've got to go now. Okay, Harry R. What you are saying is that radio waves based on magnetic and electric fields wouldn't exist. What is ridiculous about that? That means radio wave or something else since they exist. This is Franklin's further comment. And then Harry's answer is, no, I'm saying that what you say is ridiculous. Well, it's getting a bit hard to do over the thing now. The only thing that magnetic fields is the motion of charged particles and electrons. The only thing. Let's see what Jim has said now. This implies that the speed of a Michelson interferometer with respect to the ether is only due to the Earth's rotation. This velocity is too small to be detected by classical Michelson interferometers. And Harry's made another comment here. The video, that's probably the one we just shown, is incorrect in its interpretation of the Maxwell equations. That interpretation is false. Okay, well, I'm not convinced. I think it's not quite correct either, but we'd have to go into more detail in regard to that. Has the fast Earth, as it goes around the ether, ever been discovered? How fast? Okay, well, we're nearing the end. We do have about 8 minutes left if there are any pressing matters. I don't know if there's any point in showing a third video, which takes 3 minutes on two fundamental mistakes. Maybe we should do that, actually, if nobody is really wants to make any. Franklin says the Miller experiments produced a value consistent with what we measure for our velocity and direction through the cosmic microwave background radiation. Okay. Okay. Well, perhaps could you expand on your objections beyond ridiculous and wrong? Just acting. Yeah. Well, we could do a talk on this in the future, maybe. Franklin has rather radical views with regard to looking at the phenomena which undoubtedly exist. I mean, they've been verified by Faraday and subsequently, but he interprets them in quite a different way. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I think we all do in many respects. I interpret the view of the whirlpool galaxies as being quite contrary to what is constantly put before us. But Franklin's views frequently require a lot of conversation, and they can degenerate into just mudslinging back and forth. So we could do a talk on that. We could do a debate on that, but I'm not sure if there would be much of a demand for that. Harry says the claim that electric fields create magnetic fields and vice versa is an incorrect interpretation. Yeah, I would agree with that. The claim that electric fields create magnetic fields and vice versa is an incorrect interpretation of Maxwell's equations. You see, frequently we can get Maxwell's equations and then we can try to interpret them in the English language instead of keeping to the mathematics. And then we can sort of have that as a straw man to beat down, but it's only a straw man. It's not a real interpretation. So somebody may like to condense all these ideas and give us a talk in the future. And now we're coming down, you see, to the MMX, and Breat and Hall has been introduced by Jim. He says, according to Professor Howard Hayden, the Breat-Hall experiment of 1979 detected a velocity consistent with the Earth's rotation speed. I can send you a reference. I thought, by the way, Jim, that was more Aspton's analysis rather than Hayden. Maybe Hayden had taken that, but I think it was Aspton who first did that. Yeah. So no, this would be consistent with the view that there is not an appreciable slippage between the Earth's rotation, revolution about the sun, and the ether. But there is a significant, almost complete slippage between the Earth's rotation, daily diurnal rotation, and the Earth. So you can measure the latter, but not the former by looking at doing an MMX type experiment on the Earth's surface, as distinct from, say, higher up, which is what Miller did, or even higher up in space. Okay, I think I'm almost stymied in trying to introduce a 3-minute further talk, because I think we have a few more comments coming in which we'd better deal with rather than okay, pinch effect. So what's Franklin saying again? Harry, but the EM wave equation exactly relies on the preparation of electric fields from magnetic fields. That is how they suffer. Yeah, the generation of electric fields from magnetic fields. That is how they self-propagate. The equations are not exactly symmetrical. There's this extra displacement current, which gives rise to the wave equation. Had you not that, the thing would just basically disappear. Okay. And we haven't talked either about the modification of Maxwell's equations that actually was first proposed by Hertz, where you were introducing things like total derivatives to account for the sort of basic flow within a unit, where you have something which actually has a velocity relative to that unit as well, like a sort of a fluid mechanics type basis, where you don't just use the partial time derivative, but you use the total convective derivative. And actually, the surprising thing, I mean, I was shocked when I saw this, that the Maxwell's equations become invariant under Galilean transformation when you make that modification to the equations to get the Hertz variation. So okay. Now we're going to have to summarize now. Just maybe one more comment. Thanks, Jim. So this observation seems counter to other experiments which have alleged to detect how fast light travels in a constant velocity. Yes, Jerry. What's Franklin saying? Light obviously doesn't travel at a constant velocity. What is true is that light travels at the same speed regardless of the speed of the transmitter or receiver. Well, I think you've made an error there. I'd agree with it, regardless of the speed of the transmitter, but not regardless of the speed of the receiver. That does actually introduce the normal Galilean addition. So I would claim. And Jim says for a second order instrument. Okay, well, look, the fact that the comments are still coming in, and I haven't had time to play the third video, albeit that I've played one twice, owing to my own error, has indicated that today has not been an unsuccessful attempt to get to the bottom of some of the ideas of Jean de Clement's ideas. He has a lot of videos there, and I would encourage a lot of you, all you who have participating through the various media here, maybe to have a look at those. And, if you have any specific comments, particularly in regard to things that you think we've missed or we haven't adequately covered, whether we haven't given Jean de Clement a fair assessment and maybe have misinterpreted his ideas, or whether they're even more ridiculous than we think they are, please let us know, and we can have a further chat on that. We're hoping, by the way, to have a further discussion on longitudinal electromagnetic radiation, or maybe Tesla waves. We're possibly going to have Roger Anderton come back and talk to us in the coming weeks about that. So you might keep a note out and try to keep your Saturdays free. As I say, the intention is to have meetings every Saturday, but that doesn't always occur. And every second Saturday, we are basically set for the coming months anyway to have talks on these more technical sessions. and the other weeks, will be held more general discussions where appropriate. So I think we're going to have to stop it now because the time has run out. But thank you all very, very much for your patience with today's presentation, and for your very valuable comments. And again, the comments between all of you participating in social media, even though not all of them can be answered, some of them are answered, that is most welcome, and I do encourage you to continue to do that. And finally, thank you all very much in the green room for helping me as usual. I'm sorry that Bob Gray had to pull out because he was in at the beginning, but I'd like to thank Dennis Allen, James Keane, Jim Morrison, and Franklin Hu. And I'm sorry Harry couldn't get in because I would have liked his comments, in real time rather than just back and forth. But we can return to all these questions again at a further stage. So on behalf of CNPS, I'd like to thank you all very, very much for participating and spending 2 hours of your valuable time in whatever hemisphere of the world you are. So I'll wish you all a very good day, and I'll end the broadcast now.